I'm amazed I get invited to this stuff. It just blows my mind. First thing, I work in trade. I work in some development stuff. But if you look at the title, what does this have to do with either of this? So actually, Gordon Hanson writes me an email 2 years ago. And he says, we'd like some new blood to come into the immigration literature and contribute. And we're going to put together a volume, and basically gave me blank slate to think about immigration. And so this is what's come out of it. It's actually working. It's very new. I haven't been working on it for 2 years, so all apologies. But we'll see what we got going here. So the way I think about, what's amazing about immigration, this is kind of exciting about it, is it's amazing that this is probably one of the most topical things that's come out. And I just happened to be writing a paper right on the same time. And so, like, one example of this is, let's see if this is going to work. There's Mark Zuckerberg. He's the guy that you see being outspoken, talking about pro-immigration. And the basic argument behind this is you have these tech companies. They're looking for skilled labor. They can't find it. And they'd like the U.S. government to change our immigration policies to provide more skilled labor to these companies that need it. Okay, and so we got Mark Zuckerberg there. And you're like, oh, this guy comes to China or Taiwan and starts talking about Trump. Trump's on the other side. You can't literally turn on the news in USA without hearing Trump saying something about immigration. In particular, he's not talking about high-skilled immigration when he talks about the wall, Mexico paying for the wall, and so forth. But when you think about what is he talking about, though? He's talking about, this is just basically demand-supply kind of thing, is that we have more people come in, it's going to increase the supply of labor, real wages are going to go down, incumbents are going to be worse off. Okay, so he picks up this kind of issue. So what I want to do is I want to think about a situation partly entertaining some concerns that Trump has, but also entertaining some concerns or issues that in the literature of what I've read, I'm new to this literature, that hasn't really been addressed. So the first thing I want to do is write down a model where there's going to be explicit winners and losers, or potentially explicit winners and losers from immigration. So some people are going to benefit. So this is like Mark Zuckerberg. He owns all this capital, doesn't have a lot of workers to go with that capital. Of course he wants more workers. But then you have incumbent workers that might be crowded out or they might lose their job. Of course they're going to lose, and they're going to be upset about this. All right, so that's the first issue I want to address in this paper. The second issue I want to address is dynamics. I want to trace out the dynamic response of the economy to a change in immigration policy. And in fact, I think the takeaway that from this is dynamics are really going to matter. And what I mean by dynamics is I'm going to have a model of firms making explicit dynamic choices, and there's going to be a policy regime, and I'm going to trace out the complete transition path. I'm going to tell you how wages, output, consumption responds to this policy. Okay, so how am I going to do this? So I'm going to write down, it's like, yesterday's plenary talk was actually, it made me think, but made me feel really bad. I was like, I'm rolling in here with heterogeneous firm, CS, monopolistic competition model. Like this is, this is what I'm rolling here with, so this is what I got. The key thing is not to kind of, this is going to be, it's going to be set up in like quote unquote Mellett style, but this is actually going to be more looking like Hope and Hein Rogerson. Okay, so firms are making an endogenous entry decision, and they're making an endogenous exit decision. And then productivity is going to follow some Markov process, so there's going to be non-trivial transition dynamics. Okay. Layered on top of this is going to be a Roy model. And basically, this is going to generate heterogeneity across workers, and it'll lead to situations where there could be winners or losers from immigration. So this seems like the second kind of key ingredient to speak to these kind of two questions I want to answer. And just to kind of tell you, again, kind of point out what's going to be going on here is that, so this is one of these things with this heterogeneous firm monopolistic competition models, there's increasing returns to scale here. So having a bigger labor force is a good thing. that does deliver, at least in the long run, gains to having a larger labor force. Okay, so this kind of sets up the set for this. There are gains there from having a higher labor force, but that's a long run gain. That's not saying anything about what's happening in the short run. Okay, short run's going to be driven by these kind of things. Is like I said, endogenous exit and free entry, and then the process through which firms enter the market and can expand or they contract. Okay, and that's going to lead to non-trivial transition dynamics. This thing has been really influenced. So I have this colleague, Kim Rule, with George Alessandria, who's written this paper talking about trade liberalizations and tracing out the dynamics in response to trade liberalizations. And one of the key things that they show is the transition dynamic, the speed at which firms can expand in response to trade liberalization really matters for computing the welfare gains. And that's I'm not going to have a lot to say today, but this is kind of something I think that's important here, is the speed at which firms can enter in response to this is going to be really important into determining at least the short-run response to immigration. And then, like I said, I'm going to have heterogeneous workers floating through here. And then all I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you about the model, some details. I'm going to calibrate it as best as I can, or I could in the past 2 weeks, and then compute some policy experience. And then I'll show you the transition dynamic and then how this plays out. And then tell you, I don't know, we can go back and talk about winners and losers and how to think about changes in immigration. And I forgot to say this. So I'm going to focus on today, this is partly the directive that Gordon sent me, but think about this H-1B visa program. So literally performing some policy that Mark Zuckerberg might advocate and asking what's going to happen to that. You could ask what happens if you build a wall in here? Not going to do that today though, but that might be interesting. Okay, so the model is just going to be, so this is the consumer side. Consumers are also workers, so that's always to keep in mind, but I'm just going to chop this up in a slightly different way. Really simple. All they do is eat, so there's some utility function over how they eat. I'm not going to specify that. I mean, in fact, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to, let's say that for a second, or later, where that might matter. The consumption bundle is going to be CS, so that's what I'm rolling in here with, like what Jacques was talking about. Sigma's elasticity of substitution. You have these varieties omega, and then the mass of varieties consumed is floating around there. And that's an endogenous variable. And then consumers here, they're the workers too, and they just supply labor units inelastically. And I'll tell you in a couple slides exactly how they're going to supply labor units. Okay, so firms, this is the way they operate. So there's a large pool of monopolistic competitive firms. They're all there. Some are operating, some are potential entrants. The ones that once they enter, they're going to be heterogeneous over productivity. I'm going to call that Z. And then this is going to follow some Markov process. Okay? And then the transition matrix associated with that Markov process is just going to be called script P. Linear production technology, so I'm not going to be thinking about explicitly capital here. But in the background, when we think about these entry costs and how to map them back to the owners of the firm, that's something interesting to think about, but there's not like physical capital showing up in the production function. And then like I said, so there's going to be incumbents. They're going to be operating, but the kind of what makes the decision of a incumbent interesting is they're facing a per period fixed cost to operate next period. So this is exactly like Hope and Hein-Rogerson, if you're familiar with that. So you have to pay that fixed cost. If you pay that fixed cost, you get to operate tomorrow. If you don't pay that fixed cost, you just operate today, and then you exit. You're gone. Okay? I'm going to denominate these fixed costs in units of goods. I can come back to tell you like details about why I'm doing that, but it's in units of the final consumption good. And then potential entrants just face this one-time entry cost, kappa E, to enter the market. All right? Okay. So workers. This is where it gets a little bit more intricate. And so the idea here is I want some kind of situation where workers are going to be sorting across firms in a particular way. And I'm going to do it in one way. In some ways, this might, so I'm looking where Yunsuk is. Maybe he's not here, but oh, there he is. This might look similar to what he was talking about. It's like I'm looking out here. It's a big room. So what I want is so the basic idea is workers are being heterogeneous in efficiency units. And their efficiency units are going to differ depending on the productivity level of the firm. Okay, so with all of without apology or not, I'm going to really exploit this kind of think about firms are of types, Z types. That's a discrete number of states, and then workers are going to have a finite number of efficiency units that correspond with the efficiency units that they have when they work with that particular firm. Okay, so workers' endowments here is going to be in length, so it's the same as the productivity states. And this is the vector of efficiency units. So I'm just going to call this epsilon 1, ... epsilon n. And again, that's their efficiency units when they work with firm. If it's epsilon 1, that's the efficiency units that that worker has when he's working with firm number 1. Okay, and so forth. Okay, number 2. So I don't know. This is like my one toolkit is crochet. I'm sorry. It happened. So in the trade, I started doing trade stuff, and then in some work with David Lagakos, who kind of realized this is super useful in labor market stuff, and I'm going to exploit that here today too. So, efficiency units for type I firms is going to be distributed in the population according to this Frichet distribution. So how does this work? Ravi explained this 30 minutes ago, but just to review, there's the TI parameter, and that's controlling the average level of the efficiency unit. So another way to think about that's the absolute advantage of a worker working with type I firm. And then there's the theta here. So that's controlling the dispersion in efficiency units across workers. Okay. And then efficiency units across firm types are just going to be independently distributed. So that's going to make our lives kind of simple. So the final complication on the worker side is I'm going to add in some more heterogeneity here. So I'm going to think about high skilled and low skilled kind of workers. Okay. And I'll tell you in a second here. So there's going to be some mass of low skilled workers. So this is where I could talk about the wall. They're going to be efficiency units are going to be Frichet with a set of parameters, so a set of T's, and then a theta. And then there's a mass of high skilled workers. So they're going to be distributed Frichet with some T parameters and a theta. So for today, I can handle different thetas across worker types. I could keep those things different. I don't really have a way to calibrate that or how to think about that. So today, just keep life simple. That's going to be the same. But the key thing is what's really going to be important, or why I was doing this, is thinking about these T's and how they vary across firm types. And so there's some other people, I haven't wrote down these propositions, but Arnaud, Cosino, and John Bogle have shown in these situations that depending on how these T's vary across call them firm types or sectors or what have you, you start getting a situation where you get assortative matching, where you get high type workers disproportionately select into, or high skilled workers would disproportionately select into high type firms. Okay, and we'll see how that's going to play out here. The idea here is, quantitatively, I don't have anything to show you today. Partly this is pretty new, but the thinking is that workers are at different points in the firm size distribution, and then how the firm size distribution reacts to the change in immigration might differ depending on how things are all set up. So that's I don't think it's going to show up to it. We can speculate on here, but that's partly what I wanted to have here. This is also going to empirically generate a size wage premium. So you'll see bigger firms in my model will pay on average higher wages. All right. Okay. Optimization problems. So it's pretty straightforward. Incumbent firms produce and stay, or they exit. So if there's a simple CS or monopolistic competition problem where they're choosing prices and then labor, and this is important, labor units, not bodies, number of efficiency units that they need to maximize operating profits. And then the price that they choose is just going to be some markup over their marginal cost, which is going to be something about the wage per efficiency unit that they're paying. Then how do they do, what do? They choose to operate next period or exit. So that if they want to stay, they have to pay this fixed operating costs. Otherwise, they just receive the operating profits and then cease operation, they exit. And then entrants, they're going to receive some initial productivity from some density P of E at cost kappa E. Then once they get that productivity, they're just like an incumbent, all right? So workers and consumers, what do? They select amongst the firm types that's going to yield the highest labor earnings. And then given those labor earnings, they just purchase the varieties and consume. Okay, so that's the way this is working. So some value functions if you want to see this. So this is the value of incumbent firm, operates, pays the cost, and continues. So that's his expected value. So I'm abstracting from the aggregate state variables here. So I'm just thinking on the firm's individual state variable, which all that's relevant is his productivity. So that's what he gets if he continues. That's what he gets if he stops, and he selects the maximum on those. And then we have the value of the free entry condition is right here. So expected value of entering is just equal to the expected value associated with here, net of the fixed costs to enter. All right? So that's pretty straightforward. And then what do we got here? Workers. So workers' optimization problem is they're selecting across firms where they're going to be paid higher labor earnings. The way this thing works, though, is that there's like, I'm going to call it, this might be a bad language. I always feel bad because my advisor's sitting there when I use bad language too. If Robbie wasn't here, I'd be okay saying bad language. But like, there's like a quote unquote like local labor market for each type Z. I don't know if that's bad language or not, but the thing is it's like a local labor market where there's going to be a prevailing wage per efficiency unit for labor in that local labor market. So what does that mean? Rather than just solving out for one wage, like if there's homogeneous labor, I'm solving out for in wages for those wage per efficiency units for each firm type to make sure that firm labor demand is equal to labor supply, okay? Given these wages per efficiency units, workers are just going to choose across the firms which is going to maximize labor income. Okay, so what do they get? What's labor income? It's going to be epsilon plus the wage per efficiency unit and so forth, all right? Now, this is where the Frichet thing makes this stuff really nice. So you think about the problem. I have this dynamic firm problem that I'm going to have to solve computationally. That's kind of hard. But I also want to handle all this labor market heterogeneity. The Frichet stuff allows me to make the labor market heterogeneity all of a sudden become static and in closed form. So I don't have to worry about any kind of computational issues in terms of solving that. And how does this work? I get this nice closed form expression that says, well, the fraction of workers selecting into type I firms is just something about the wage per efficiency unit and the productivity associated with working with that type I firm. And this looks exactly like in the trade literature. When you look at these things, so if a type I firm pays a high wage per efficiency unit, more workers will want to select into that type I firm. If that workers have a higher absolute advantage at working with type I firms, more workers will want to select into working with type I firms, okay? And then you can also compute, this is going to be in the background when I'm going to compute average wages, but the expected productivity of a worker selecting into a type I firm is something about absolute advantage, and then the share of workers that actually select in there. And this shows up with a negative sign. What does that mean? Is as a worker, as a larger share of workers select into a type I firm, they're drawing in less productive workers. So the expected productivity of a worker in type I firm is going down. Now this is kind of important because in the background, this is showing up as there's an upward sloping labor supply curve that the firms are facing. So when firms try to expand, all of a sudden they're drawing in less and less productive workers, and that's limiting the number of efficiency units that they can acquire, okay? So here's the plan of attack. So how much time do I got? Sorry, like 10 minutes, great. Okay, so I'm gonna calibrate the model. This is pretty rough actually, because I was like working like a dog last week trying to get this going. And then I'm gonna illustrate some properties of the model, and then that'll be it. Okay, so the calibration is, I'm gonna just kind of pick some parameters that I think are reasonable, and then match some features of some firm level data, which I think I need more work on, but this is what we got today. So demand elasticity, I'm going to set that equal to 4. That's pretty standard. I mean, it's like, in this literature, at least in firm dynamics, they typically appeal to things like markups, and the level of the that might be a little high here, but it's okay. Discount rate, 0.95. So I'm thinking about this as a yearly model. I mean, maybe that's too high too. And then the entry cost right now is it's well known. You can't identify this thing, so you just normalize it to 1. Okay. So what I'm going to do what do I have? I have something about the shock process. I have something about the cost of exiting or operating, and then something about the entry distribution. So how am I dealing with this, the Markov process on Z is, I'm just going to say, in a typical way is a discrete state approximation, like Tauken's method, and it's going to imply some autocorrelation, and then some standard deviation of these shocks. And I'm going to pick the autocorrelation, the standard deviation of these shocks to match to the autocorrelation of size. So I've actually been playing around with this synthetic longitudinal business database. I don't know if this is, I mean, there's always questions about with the synthetic database, if this, maybe Mark, do you know much about this? Or is not, I don't know. There's always a question about how good this is, but this is what I got. And then the standard deviation of the log productivity is going to match the relative size between the mean and the median firm in the US data. So that's about approximately 2, okay? The other thing is that I want this stuff I actually care about a lot because I think it's important for the firm dynamics, or especially when the reform changes, is because you're going to see this, is there's going to be a bunch of new firms that are going to enter, and so you're going to want the dynamics of those new firms to be reflective of what we see in the data. So this cap is going to be pinned down by the probability of survival of entrants after 5 years, and so this is about 50%. And then this entry rate, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the entry distribution is just going to be the invariant distribution of the shocks, but the mean is going to be shifted, okay? So it's going to make it look like new firms are going to be relatively more or less productive. And I want to calibrate this so I have an entry rate of about 10%. And so this turns out that this shifts the productivity distribution by about 10 percentage points, okay? All right, so that's the kind of the firm side. The workers side is going to be like this. So this is still pretty rough too. So we're going to think about LU, so the unskilled workers is less than college, and LS, so the skilled workers, is college or more. So the LU is just going to be some normalization, and then you look at labor force. So this is about skilled workers is about 65% of the LU, so that's there. Then on the worker heterogeneity, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the state equal to 3. Again, I'm still working on how to think through how to calibrate this thing. But if you look at some papers who have thought about this in the context of labor market kind of context, so like my earlier work with David, or Alwyn Young has a paper on this, or Ariel Burstein and co-authors have a paper on this, a theta of 3 I don't think is unreasonable. And then the final thing, what I'm going to do is these T's, so low skill workers are just going to be, have no absolute advantage or disadvantage across any kind of firm. So a plumber in Goldman Sachs is the same as a plumber in I don't know, like the North Carolina, where were you saying? Yeah, Morgan Stanley, yeah, it's like, yeah, that's good. Yeah, but then the skilled workers, I'm going to make this a log linear function of the shocks. Okay, and again, this is trying to get this assortative matching here. There's going to be some elasticity rho of Z. And so the basic idea is if this rho of Z is greater than 0, then high skilled workers are going to have an absolute advantage in high type firms, and then that's going to get relatively more high skilled workers selected into high type firms, okay? And then because type is mapping into size, you'll see higher skilled workers disproportionately work in bigger firms, okay? This turns out to, and then I'm going to calibrate this to basically match the average wages in firms above the median size to those below the medium size. And this turns out to be 1.3. So this is like a size wage premium here. All right. Okay, so let me show you some things about how workers are selecting across firms, and then I'll tell you about the immigration reform. So this is remember, this is discrete. I have a lot of grid points here, so this just kind of looks continuous, but this is still discrete. So first thing to notice is, so here's log firm productivity, and then the share of workers that are into that particular firm. So first, higher productivity, larger share of either high skill or low skill are going into that particular firm. All that's saying is that big firm, high productivity firms are big firms. They require more labor, so they're paying higher efficiency units to draw in more workers, okay? But then you can see how the T's are mattering here is because now there's some point at which there are firms that have relatively larger share of high skilled workers than low skilled workers. So this is getting into this kind of sort of matching situation. And then how does that map into wages? Is this is the actual average wage of a firm in logs relative to log firm productivity. And what you see is that higher, more productive firms, bigger firms are paying higher wages. Okay. All right. So what I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna kind of just stop, like whip through this. So I'm gonna calibrate, like simulate a policy experiment where what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna think about the Zuckerberg policy. Okay, what's the Zuckerberg policy? I'm going to think about a change in the H-1B visa program. So that's the, like quantifies a quota each year for how many high-skilled workers can come into the United States. I'm going to double that, okay? And that's on the flow. I'm going to permanently double that until the stock of the, like I'm going to permanently double it, okay? Now what is that going to do? That's going to change the flow of high-skilled workers for the indefinite future. Now I'm going to treat this policy as unanticipated. Firms are going to wake up, they're going to see the new policy, and then they're going to adjust. Okay? And then I'm going to trace out the transition dynamics as the firms adjust in response to this policy. Okay? So here's the change in the high-skilled labor supply that I put in here. So you can H-1B visa, this is actually a pretty small number. So this is like 65,000 per year. Doubling it gets you to like, what, 130,000 or 100, what have you. I can't double it off the top of my head. But you double it, it's relative to the stock of high-skilled, of labor force in the United States. It's a pretty small number. But then it's going to it takes a long time to converge, but after 150 years, it amounts to about a 4.5% increase in things. So one thing to kind of think about, you're smiling at me, is like, this is actually a small change. Like if you actually double this thing, this is not a big impact. I mean, just when you think about it. So what is it going to happen with firms? So here's what happens with wages by type. So I'm always plotting this relative to the old steady state. Blue is low skill, orange is high skill. MATLAB 2016 now decides blue and orange is the better color format. So the first thing to notice, there's no change in real wages for low skill. Barely a decrease in real wages for high skill workers. Okay? Partly this is because this is small, partly because I'm going to show you in a second, there's a dynamic response from firms in response to the change in the policy. Okay? So then over time, so I'm only tracing this out 20 years. It keeps going off out here. Over time, wages start going up, and this is just coming from the scale effect. Okay? Now what's going on here is, why don't wages go down for the high skill workers? Or why don't they go down more? Well, it's because there's a dynamic response from firms once they understand there's this new policy. And it's coming through the free entry. So what happens is when this policy is announced, there's all of a sudden a huge rush of firms in the market to take advantage of this. So this is about a 2.5% increase in the mass of entering firms relative to the previous steady state. There's some kind of shakeout which generates this like U-shaped thing, and then this thing just increases back to up to its steady state. Now this is kind of interesting because you might be thinking, okay, well Mike, you said that wages aren't going down. That doesn't seem like that's necessarily a bad thing. Well, wages aren't the measure of, I'm not going to tell you a formal welfare metric today, but I'm going to talk about consumption. Okay? Now, what happens when new firms show up into the market? That is like a form of investment. They're paying these entry costs. Those entry costs are coming out of goods that could have been eaten. That's reducing consumption. And that's what you see pretty clearly here, is aggregate consumption, aggregate output goes up. We have more workers, we have more firms, output's going up, but consumption's going down because we have more investment right now. All right? Is this going down just because this is aggregate consumption? If I do a consumption per worker, no, it's still going down. All right? So let me kind of summarize some takeaways. So this is like across steady states. To summarize the number, I'm almost out of time. Let me just wrap up with this one kind of thing. So wages aren't changing. In the short run, no change. Long run, they get better. Okay, so from a wage earner's standpoint, this actually doesn't seem like, if you just look at wages, it doesn't seem like this is a bad thing. So negligible effect on this. But the key thing is that there is a short run loss in consumption. So this is where this policy actually might not be a welfare, short run welfare loss. Okay, and it's coming through this investment kind of channel. Is that, think about Mark Zuckerberg. He has capital, but once he gets these more these new workers, he wants to accumulate some more capital to take advantage of it. That means there's less consumption today because there's all this investment. All right. In the long run, this actually takes a long run to play out. We have this scale effect coming through the expansion and variety. Okay. So the one thing I don't have is welfare is kind of complicated here because you got to actually now think carefully about how the profits are going to be allocated across different worker types. And that's something I still need to think through a bit. And I don't have an answer today. Okay, so I'm just going to end here. It's still baking, but lots to do, lots to learn. Super interesting topic. Hopefully you guys thought. Any feedback you have, I'm more than happy to hear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but